personality from several fields, from banking, from financial sector, from civil service, from administration, in various sectors. An eminent illustrious personality is addressing this webinar. A widely acknowledged and respected thought leader in various fields of policy making, governance, leadership, transformation, a former IAS officer, as Comrade C.H. Venkatachalam was telling, a former joint secretary in the banking division in the Ministry of Finance, a former chairman of Unit Trust of India, of IDBA, and importantly, SEBI, Securities Exchange Board of India. It is a great privilege to welcome you, sir, for this webinar. And a brief introduction. He needs no introduction. Nevertheless, a master's degree holder in economics, from University of Madras, a law degree holder from University of Delhi, and he is the youngest ever chief secretary in any state in India. At the age of 44, he was made the chief secretary of Tripura. He was joined the IAS cadre, and he has got an interesting connection with the banking sector also, because when he began the career, he joined as a probationary officer in Indian Bank. He worked there for 6 months. Thereafter, he left Indian Bank and joined country's largest bank, then and now State Bank of India, as a probationary officer. After that, after 6 months, again he left that bank and joined civil service as a civil servant. And as we said earlier, in various capacities he has worked. And it was during this tenure as in the banking division in the Ministry of Finance, our great leader, Comrade Tarkeshwar Chakravarti, had great interactions with this illustrious personality. And in 2001, he was appointed as UTI, one of the investment institutions in India. At that time, it was facing severe setbacks and near collapse. And it was because of the stewardship of Comrade Shri Damodaran sir that UTI was resurrected. And again, IDBA, one of the development financial institutions in India, that also faced severe setbacks. And because of the intervention and the leadership given by Shri Damodaran sir, IDBA was resurrected. But then it was converted as commercial bank. That is another part of history. And importantly, as chairman of the SEBI, SEBI got a name in the securities market, in the share market. SEBI made an impact under the leadership and the chairmanship of Shri Damodaran sir. Qualified institutional placement, a new mechanism was instituted under the stewardship of Shri Damodaran sir. And when he was chairman of SEBI, he was elected as chairman of the Emerging Markets Committee of the International Organization of Securities Commissions. And many posts he has discharged his role. I am not elaborating. As chairman of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs Committee for Reforms in the Regulatory Environment for Facilitating Ease of Doing Business in India. He was in the Reserve Bank of India's Committee on Customer Service in Banks. And he is the founder of the Indian Institute of Management, Tiruchirappalli. He chaired the Task Force on Corporate Governance constituted by the FICCI. And he is the director on the boards of many companies in the corporate sector, Arsan Trupro, Hero, Motor, like so many companies. And he is also the chairman of the Indigo. And like that. And he is running a corporate governance firm by name Excellence Enablers. So a versatile personality. So on behalf of all the members attending here, on behalf of All India Bank Employees Association, I welcome Shri Damodaran sir for this webinar series. And I am not stray into the subject he is going to deal today. And we know the topic today is public sector banks' next steps. So it is definitely going to be futuristic. And when we are from All India Bank Employees Association, we are celebrating the 52nd anniversary of the bank nationalization. As far as AIBEA is concerned, from the very beginning, state ownership, governance, management control, policy setting role, state structure, on state-owned structure. So that we fought from 1946 in the parliament. Our representative, our general secretary, then general secretary was in the parliament, Lok Sabha for 2 terms. So within parliament, outside parliament. So we stand for the state ownership, control, policy setting role of the state for the public sector. And even in the pandemic period, we know whether it is PMGKY, ECLGS, PM Kisan, PM Sonidhi, or whatever propositions, support, relief, stimulus packages, it is public sector banks. Majority, over 95% of all the support measures are rendered by the public sector banks only. But unfortunately, in the name of governance, again, in the governance is a very, very important theme for Shri Damodaran sir. So quoting governance, international best practices, unfortunately, these public sector banks are subjected to privatization. And we know the governance standards recent that has episodes with regard to S-Bank also, Divan Housing, ILFS. Sometimes back, Damodaran sir was writing about Franklin Templeton also, a mutual fund. So all these are happening. Still, this government is going ahead. The PGNI committee report in 2014 that was initiated by the previous government, same government is continuing. Public sector reform agenda, this government is carrying forward. In this context, what will be the future step? That we are very much eager to listen from Shri Damodaran sir. So I request Shri Damodaran sir to address us. Incidentally, I am very privileged because I also belong to the place from which Shri Damodaran sir hails. I am talking from Thiruvananthapuram. I also belongs to Palakkad. So മേലെ വീട്ടിൽ ദാമോദരൻ സാറ് ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് വലിയ സന്തോഷമുണ്ട് അങ്ങയെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യാൻ. So on behalf of all of us, we welcome you and invite you to address us. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan, for those very, very kind words. President, Mr. Nagar, my old friend, Mr. Venkatachalam, Mr. other office bearers of AIBEA. Thank you for giving me this privilege. This is an extraordinary privilege. I recognize it's not a privilege that is given to too many people who have spent a major part of their life in the bureaucracy. I looked at the list of 30 persons that would be sharing thoughts with you during this 1 month. And I see myself as the only one belonging to a different species altogether, which means that in some sense you have recognized that even if one is a bureaucrat, and that word has assumed several meanings, several dimensions over the years, there can still be a human being with his heart in the right place, who has a sense of empathy, a sense of compassion, sense of commitment, and a sense of courage and conviction to speak what he likes. I've often been faulted for not having a mental filter, for saying what I think without applying a mental filter. But that is something I have survived for close to 75 years, and I don't think that that is going to set me back. Before I share some thoughts with you on public sector banks, allow me to set the context in which we are having this discussion today. There are a lot of persons who, and I've said this times before, who believe that the sun rises in the west. We were all taught in school that the sun rises in the east. But there are some people who believe the sun rises in the west. I have no problem if it stopped with that. But over decades, the sun rises in the west category has influenced public policy. And therefore, outdated thoughts, outdated technologies in the name of appropriate technologies for less developed countries, in the name of thoughts that had outlived their utility there, in fact, some of them were stillborn, are being passed on to us as the mantra for economic and social reforms. That is a major problem I've had. The other problem that I've had is when I hear people talk about privatization and efficiency in the same breath. I've been saying this for the last more than 20 years. In public fora as well as outside in one-on-one conversation, I've written about it, that there is no dictionary in the world which treats privatization and efficiency as synonyms. These mean two different things to all those who care to know. If one doesn't care to know and believes that privatization automatically translates to efficiency, better productivity, that's clearly not an argument that most sensible people, even if they consult dictionaries, will buy. The second, and this is a statement that I've made and I'm fond of making, it derives from what I've said till now, is that efficiency is ownership neutral. You can have excellent public sector undertakings, terrible public sector undertakings. You can have excellent private sector undertakings and terrible private sector. And we've seen examples of this time and time again. To say that efficiency is related to a kind of ownership, that is not something that we should buy. And that is, in fact, the burden of my song today. The example I'm fond of giving is that of the mills that ultimately went to the National Textile Corporation. At some stage in my career, I was in the Ministry of Textiles and I was dealing with the cotton textile industry, and therefore I had a lot of interaction with the National Textile Corporation. So I know the history of those mills, and I know that all of them which turned sick were owned by individuals and families and groups which were considered the best and the brightest by some individuals in the country. And yet they squeezed the blood out of those mills and left it to the National Textile Corporation to take over. And many of them have been turned around by the National Textile Corporation. So it substantiates my argument that if business is conducted properly, it doesn't matter whether you're publicly owned or privately owned. And to think, and we've had any number of examples, I think Mr. Krishna referred to Yes Bank or DHFL and things like that. All of them are private sector entities which came to grief fairly quickly. If you go back a little earlier and look at the banking sector itself, after 1949, we did not have any new banks till the early 90s, when new licenses were given out. In between, the major step was the nationalization in 2 rounds of what were older private banks, 14 in the first phase, 6 in the second phase. Of course, New Bank of India got merged into Punjab National Bank, and therefore for a long time we had 19 public sector banks, other than the State Bank of India group, which was the SBI plus 7 banks in the SBI group, which have all now been folded into the SBI. Now, when these new bank licenses were handed out, there were 9 new licenses for new entities and 1 license for a cooperative bank to convert to a commercial bank, to a scheduled commercial bank. Now, look at the fate of those. Who would now remember that there was a license given to Times Bank, for example? Who would remember that Global Trust Bank, which was a fraud on the system, and I'm not mincing my words, because a gentleman with a great reputation applied for the license. He was a former ADB official, but the bank was run by somebody else. If you look at the name of the applicant, and your friends who are in the Reserve Bank of India will give you the evidence, it was a gentleman called Mr. Madhav, I forget his second name. This is for a long time. An economist worked in the ADB. The application was in his name. It had his name and associates. But when the license came, it was Ramesh Gelli who ran it. And we know that he ran it to the ground. Ramesh Gelli, incidentally, and I'm telling you how the system rewards people. Ramesh Gelli, incidentally, was the first Padma Award winner in the banking sector. He got a Padma Shri. Staying with Padma Awards for a while, and I refer to one large private sector bank as the Padma Bhushan Bank, where 3 people got Padma Bhushan, one after the other. And the interesting thing is that one of them got it for expanding the business of the bank, and the successor got it next year for contracting the business of the bank. Only one of them could have been right, and yet both got Padma Bhushan awards. So I'm only telling you the value system that prevails in the larger context in which we operate, where even today it is believed that public sector should not exist. The one truth that you forget, and when you travel to as many parts of the country as all of you have, and I certainly have, I've been to almost all states in the country at different points of time. I still have to do 2 more, but that is only because they became states later. If they were states earlier, I would have done that too. We exist at different levels. It is not just the digital divide, it's the economic divide. There is a geographical issue that India has had for many years, the East and the West being treated differently in terms of freight equalization, for example. Just to give one example, we've had several differences in the manner in which policy was both conceptualized and administered, leading to some pockets of prosperity and some pockets which suffer from relative deprivation, for want of a better word, let me call it that. Now, to think that a private sector, which has only one objective, which is profit maximization, to think that they would reach the distant corners of a country as widespread as India, as diverse as India, given its various income streams, the inequalities, and now, in some sense, I'm not against technology, but digitalization has given a deeper divide into those. Why take the COVID application? There are people who are dependent on others to get that done, and getting vaccinated is a right. Yet if technology stands in the way, you have to go and meet somebody to figure out how to get your name registered for vaccination. That divide we have not crossed yet. So this is a divide that is keeping populations at different levels within the same country, and there is no alternative to having a strong public sector presence to address the requirements of this disparate population that we have. Just think for a moment that if the Imperial Bank of India had not become the State Bank of India in 1955, and if the State Bank of India had not reached out to every nook and corner of the country, half the country would not have known what banking was. I am aware that, for example, in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, I have heard stories of people who had to catch a bus at night, travel to the district town in order to do a small banking transaction next day, maybe withdrawing some cash or depositing some cash. Nothing more complicated than that. After all, these were simple banking operations carried out by simple people to meet simple needs of their lives. Now, is that an area that the private sector banks would ever have gone to? There is just no way. There's just no way. Even if you mandate that you must have X percentage presence in rural areas, that would be token presence. There is no way you will see any productive, worthwhile banking going on. Mr. Krishnan mentioned the schemes which the public sector bank has carried on its shoulders for all these years. Which private sector bank even knows? And it's a challenge I am giving. Which private sector bank even knows the expansions of the names of some of those schemes? They might know the alphabet. Can they expand the names of those schemes? Why? Because there is no involvement, there is no responsibility, there is no liability, and therefore you leave that to the public sector banks. And then there is the tendency of people to compare financial performance. This bank is doing so much work. Look at your public sector bank. You've been around for so long and you're doing less. But public sector banks came at a time when you did not have technology, when it was a branch-based banking. All these people have come into banking when you don't need a physical presence across the country. And it's much easier to operate. You don't need a large workforce. And the large workforce has its strengths, but it doesn't automatically translate to numbers in your profit and loss. What it translates to is better services, I chaired the RBI Committee on Customer Service. I can tell you we looked at the customer service records from the RBI of all the banks. And one would have normally thought, given its large bank presence, the fact that it is a banker to every Indian almost, that State Bank of India would have had the largest number of complaints. It's only fair to expect when you're that big, you're 30% of the system, you should expect to have the largest. But State Bank did not have the largest number of complaints. That went to a bank which has been acknowledged as the best bank in the country for several years. And I've always asked this question, what is a good bank? Is a good bank the one that makes profits for its shareholders? Or is a good bank one that does the business of intermediation in a manner that the last person, the underprivileged, who is summoning courage to actually do banking? You need courage to bank. Till then, you were doing some informal kind of arrangements. You're actually going to a bank, dealing with that bank. If you don't provide service to that, I will share an incident with you which will make you people wonder what goes wrong in the minds of people. We were at this committee meeting in the IBA conference room in Delhi. And one of the members of our committee representing an NGO asked the managing director of one of the banks, private sector banks, who was in the banking delegation that came to meet us. He said, why are your charges so high? For every service that you provide, you're charging so much more. But you look at the public sector banks, they're not charging that much. And his answer was at one level very revolting. But it did not go unchallenged, I assure you. He said, you cannot go to a 5-star hotel and expect to pay Udupi rates. So I promptly told him that I don't think you have stepped into an Udupi hotel. They give you much better food than a 5-star hotel. We'll discuss rates after that. But if you look at the food, which is more tasty, objectively, you will discover you're in the wrong place when you go to the 5-star hotel. But that's the attitude. We provide banking for the classes. India is not about the classes. Whether people like it or not, India is about the masses. You can't wave a wand and wish away the masses. They're not going to go away anytime. They're people with a right. They're people with equal rights. They're people with expectations. It's just a matter of fate that some are more privileged, some are less privileged. But to think that a system should treat people differentially because of economic strata, because of the urban-rural divide, that is something that doesn't certainly appeal to me, and I'm sure doesn't appeal to all of you as well as to most other right-thinking people in the country. Yet, that is a philosophy that seems to inform decision-making at this point of time, regrettably. If we go back to nationalization itself, the first round, lots of people say it was done for political purposes. Lots of people say that the then Prime Minister needed to make some big moves, and this was one of the big moves along with abolition of privy purses. But one of the sentences, not hers, but somebody said at that time, which appealed to me, which I keep repeating, is that we are moving away from the creditworthiness of the person to the creditworthiness of the purpose. If your purpose is good, the bank must be able to finance it rather than look at who is that person. There used to be handbooks in which it was written, if you want to borrow money from a bank, wear your best clothes and go, because bankers lend only to people who look like they don't need money. Bankers don't lend to people who look like they need money. So wear your best clothes and go to the bank. Right? At the same time, there have been rich people that came in Maruti 800s, borrowed, and when they went to do the OTS, they were in the Mercedes-Benz or BMW. When they went to that, luckily, bank premises don't have helipads, otherwise they would have landed in helipads there. But clearly somebody had enriched himself at the expense of the bank as well as the unit that for with the name of which he had borrowed. So now we are looking at a situation where, in addition to the State Bank of India, we have 12 public sector banks, out of which, as you know much better than I do, there are reports that 2 banks have been identified for sale. There is no official statement yet, but every other day, like a teaser, It is coming in the paper. These are the banks. It will be announced anytime soon. This has been recommended by Niti Aayog. The Committee of Ministers has recommended. I'm also waiting for a formal decision. But you're also aware what happened in the interim. After the names of these two banks came out, the share prices went up significantly. The share prices went up significantly to an extent, and I don't hesitate to take names, that Indian Overseas Bank market cap went above the market caps of Bank of Baroda and PNB. It became a more valued bank. Why? Because suddenly it was found that this is on offer, and therefore you push it up. Now, all of us know, I have nothing against Indian Overseas Bank. I think the people there are a bunch of good guys. But even they, in their wildest dreams, will not claim that they are as big as the Punjab National Bank or the Bank of Baroda. I don't think they will claim that. It is market forces at play. And this business, and this is a conversation that I have had for a long time with a lot of people. Just look at the market cap. HDFC's market cap is more than State Bank of India. Who is concerned? The market cap does not translate to customer service. The market cap does not translate to widespread presence where you provide banking facilities to more people. It is an urban and a metropolitan presence with significant investments of money from overseas, which pushes up these prices. That's a function of demand and supply. It's a function of perception of people. Does that make a bank bigger? I don't think a bank becomes bigger because its market cap is more. I don't think a bank becomes better because it makes more profits. Its profitability is important. I'm not saying you must make loss in order to be a good bank. Far from that. I believe you must have profits, but I think it's equally important that you serve people. At the end of the day, is banking a product or a service? Banking is the provision of services through products. Products are intermediaries. To my mind, the ultimate objective is service. Even the original definition of banking, which was the acceptance of deposits for the purpose of lending or investment. But lending or investment, again, was only a process. It was for the creation of productive assets. That has nothing to do with market cap. That has nothing to do with the volume of shares traded on a daily basis in the market. I think these are issues where an organization like yourselves, and I know that all of you firmly believe in this and passionately espouse it, but you must find your way to get to people to buy the message that indiscriminate movement towards privatization is not the answer for India. It's certainly not the answer for Bharat. If you distinguish, as some people do, between Bharat and India, while some parts of India may benefit, a whole lot of Bharat will get left by the wayside if you believe only in private ownership. And we've seen this in several sectors. And I'm not talking just about the banking sector alone. Look at aviation, a sector that I am fairly familiar with at this stage in life. Did Air India have to reach this stage? It didn't have to reach this stage. You gave away routes. You didn't buy aircraft when you needed to buy aircraft. And I used to be amazed that at some point of time, we were operating 4 funds outside India. They were located in Mauritius. When I was in UTI, these were the UTI International funds. And when you went to Mauritius for meetings, you traveled by Air Mauritius. And you wondered why Air India was not flying on that. And when I asked people, they said that we don't have aircraft for so many routes. So you've given away routes, you've given away slots, you've given away various things. And now you are saying, no, Air India cannot find a good price because it will make losses, because at the right time, you have a responsibility as an owner. If you need to buy something, you need to buy it. But if you don't buy it, and you take decisions which impact on the profitability, then clearly somebody must be answerable for it. That answerability is not coming. I have a very strong view that many sectors in India where we are seeing things are coming to grief are because somewhere along the way, somebody decided that we need to So, sorry. Grind this organization to the dust so that others may prosper in the same business. So you have 12 banks now. Sorry. If the sale goes through, we'll end up with 10 public sector banks, which is 50%, and I'm keeping State Bank aside for a moment, 50% of what you started out with after the second round of nationalization. And if you're only talking in terms of Central Bank and Indian Overseas Bank, what is the guarantee that tomorrow Bank of Maharashtra will not be put up for sale, saying it's a small bank? There is no guarantee that that can't be put up for sale. What is the guarantee that some other bank will not be put up for sale thereafter? So I personally believe that there must be a strong presence, a distributed presence. Not that you can have 5 Mumbai-based public sector banks and then close the rest, not from that. You should have a pan-India distributed existence of the public sector banking space. And that is something that we need to work towards. But I believe this is also a good opportunity for me to say that public sector banks also should do some looking into themselves to see what can they do more, what can they do better. To adopt an attitude of victimhood, that, you know, somebody is riding over us and we will lie back and allow them to ride the bus over us, is not going to help public sector banks. So I think some soul searching, some introspection on what can be done to make these banks better is an urgent requirement. All organizations, and I have now advised organizations in the public and private sector, all organizations are a function of just 3 Ps, which is products, process, and people. Actually, if you look at it in the alphabetical order, it is people, processes, and products. People are the most important of the P, but most people will tell you products, processes, and people. Now, if you look at products, there was a time when the private sector banks had products that the public sector banks did not, for 2 reasons. One, this was unknown territory, so you didn't venture into that. 2, the banking regulator did not allow you to get into areas where the private sector banks are already there. It was not a level playing field. It was a field in which some people had tickets to enter the stadium and some people did not have tickets to enter the stadium. Just that. Now, in the process, and if you look at numbers of earlier years, and all of you are familiar with this, the profitability of the private sector banks came mostly from fee-based income as compared to public sector banks. Public sector banks hardly had any fee-based income. Even if they had very loyal customers who borrowed from them, you got fund-based income, which was more difficult to get than fee-based income for which they went to the private sector banks. Now, whether it was better technology today, public sector banks have as good technology as private sector banks. There is, I can share my personal experience with you. I run a small company. We have accounts in 2 banks. One is a private sector bank and one is a public sector bank. And we do all our important transactions where you cannot afford failure, like paying taxes, for example. We do through the public sector bank, for the simple reason that you don't want the tax fellow to say you didn't pay on time by, because this celebrated private sector bank, which RBI finally woke up to. I was one of the complainants saying 3 days it's shut. Will RBI do something about it? There are several people complained. I was also one of them, saying that the systems could not take what they were doing. You were indiscriminately issuing cards, various things, and your systems were not able to take. They've still not been able to fix it. So products are something that on the basis of existing technology, where public sector banks can match private sector banks. I have no doubt about it. Processes are even easier. Copying a process, even if you can't think up a process, copying a process is also easier. Now, what is the differentiator where to my mind, public sector banks have an advantage. That is the people element, which is the human touch, recognizing a customer by name rather than account number, because you are recognized by a number actually only in jail. Everybody should be recognized by your name at least. At least as a banking customer, you should not be customer ID so-and-so. You must be a person. You have a right to be known by your name. Where you reach out to people, and I can share a story with you of a bank which gave me my first paycheck, Indian Bank. It went through a lot of difficulties, but today it's doing very well. Indian Bank, in its worst time, and I'm talking about 1995, 96 onwards, in its worst time, there were two people in the bank who had accounts in the bank. One was the then Deputy Governor Tarapur, Sevak Tarapur, and the other was my father. And Tarapur, when he and I were going to a meeting to discuss the restructuring of Indian Bank, we were traveling in the same car from the RBI Delhi office to the North Block. And he was a nice, friendly man, but man of strong views. He said, you know what, I will oppose tooth and nail the proposal you're carrying in your bag to restructure Indian Bank. I'm giving you advance notice because your friend, I will oppose it tooth and nail. I had some knowledge about him from before. So I asked him in that car journey itself, but please tell me, isn't your account with Indian Bank? He said, yes. I said, then why, if it's such a bad bank, why are you not shutting it down? He said, no, the customer service is excellent. You are worried about their, at that point of time, there was a belief that credit appraisal was not a strength because the then chairman had lent indiscriminately. It had nothing to do with credit appraisal skills. But if you don't apply appraisal skills, obviously you will get suboptimal credit decisions. It's not about skills. But it was believed that there was a talk about narrow banking, etc., etc. But Tarapur said, no, but I'll continue to bank with them because customer service is good. My father, who banked for many, many years with Indian Bank, and since I was in the banking division, once when I had gone home for a short holiday, I told him the bank is going through difficulties. Do you want me to move your account to another bank? He said, no, they are looking after me very well. That's good enough for me. And they've been looking after me well for 20 years. So I don't need to change this. So the people aspect is a differentiator that going forward must be aggressively not just practiced, but even marketed. That where many banks, for example, say the interiors of the bank are good. They don't have chairs, they have sofa sets. You don't transact across counters any longer. Some of it frightens the average customer because he would rather have the old type of bank where he stands across the counter, transacts business and goes home, right? And that is why my friend O.P. Bhatt, when he used to be chairman of State Bank of India, he had one very good ad, I complimented him for it, which said that we don't have coffee vending machines or music in the bank, we only provide banking service. I thought that was very, very focused because you're not a coffee day or barista. You're a bank at the end of the day. These may be add-ons which might appeal, but the common denominator is you have to provide banking services quickly. And I think that is a strength that public sector banks must do. The second is, and I've been interacting recently with public sector banks, I've told the managements this, but this is something where you should also come in. If you look at the composition of the bank boards, there are so many vacancies. You will find typically in a public sector bank, of course, you have not had a workman director and an officer director for many years, for whatever reason, though it's a statutory provision. And I think if a post exists in statute, it must be filled. Now, you have one shareholder director, no independent directors in most of the banks. which is the case not just in banks, but even in PSUs. But why is it different in banks? Between the RBI and bank managements and to some extent the government, every public sector bank has close to 20 committees in which you need board members. And many of them have to be chaired not by your executive directors, but by the non-executive people. Now, if you have one shareholder director, one independent director, to share the burden of all, at least 10 of these 20 committees, clearly you are not going to see any quality work being done. I've been telling them collectively, whether through IBA or seeking a meeting with the minister, go and say, this is our position, give us some people. Otherwise, let us wind up some committees, combine some of these, and there is good scope for combining. Many of those committees are actually replicating some other committees. You can combine them, it's possible. I've demonstrated it to some people, taking the terms of reference and comparing it. But you have to persuade the government that you need to have people in the boards. If there are no people in the boards, what kind of leadership? Of course, the other question is, people will say, how are boards important in the banks? All decisions are taken in Delhi. What Delhi doesn't decide, RBI decides, so why do you need a board? Then abolish the board. You say we will appoint a managing director and few EDs, and you don't need a board. Why keep up the pretense that it is a board managed organization, which it is not? When you don't have a board, then you can't manage it. And in most statutes, the one mistake that we have allowed ourselves to be fooled by is a provision in most statutes that any defect in the composition of the board will not invalidate any of its proceedings or decisions. So you can leave 75% of the posts vacant. The rest of the board can take decisions, and there will be a statutory provision which says that that is not invalidated. Now, with provisions like this, clearly you need to fix these. So the statutory framework needs to be revisited. Vacancies need to be filled. There is a huge effort required for training of the right people. I think one of the things that happens is typically in the public sector, and this is an old problem in the public sector, enough is not invested in training. And whenever there is a financial squeeze, the first cut is training. Whatever training budget is there, you cut that. Why? Because the institution has no money. Now, if you do this, you're going to create a lot of people who are not able to keep pace and then develop a complex. Sometimes, in fact, people ask me when I have sessions with public sector bankers, please tell us where we are inferior to the private sector bankers. I said, your question is wrong. You are making an assumption that you're inferior. The question of where you're inferior comes only if you're inferior. You are placed in a context that is different, and therefore you're struggling where they're not having that much of a struggle. That is the only thing. And then look at what has happened in the last few years, and I thought I would hold that back to the end. Yes Bank, ICICI Bank, two classic examples. Now I want to share with you the problems that in the governance space exist. There are only two problems. One is conflict of interest, and the other is asymmetry of information. Now, if you look at conflict of interest, ICICI Bank, all what happened with the former MD and CEO, that had conflict of interest written all over it from the first day. What aspect of those series of transactions did not get hit by conflict? What happened? Nobody took notice of it. The regulator allowed it an easy pass. The press certainly was worshipping people in the private sector. So they were also not questioning hard enough till the whole thing blew open because of one whistleblower and because of his persistence. Life would have gone on like this forever and a day. Now look at Yes Bank. Didn't anybody know what was happening in Yes Bank? If 1/10 of that had happened in a public sector bank, the public sector bank chief executive would have been serving a term in jail now. Why 1/10th, even 100th maybe? It took a long time for justice to catch up with that kind of person. And I'm not even getting into the NBFC sector of DHFL or the cooperative sector of PMC Bank or all of that. But there is a feeling that if you're a private sector, nothing will affect you. Luckily, the one leveling act which didn't come courtesy the RBI or the government, but a court which said that the Prevention of Corruption Act will apply also to private sector banks. It was a court which said that in Gelli's case, that actually brought some level of parity. And one more example I want to give, and this example I am fond of giving. If you are a branch manager and I come to you and I have only 5,000 rupees with me, I want to open an account and I want a locker, and you tell me there is no locker, but I am first in the waiting list. Next day, some fellow with deep pockets comes with 50 lakh rupees. He opens account. He also wants locker. Next month, the locker becomes free. Private sector bank will give it to him. He's not going to look at me. I am 5,000 rupees. He is 50 lakh. There's no way they will look at my requirement of a locker. The public sector guy will be told, but the 5,000 rupee guy came first to you. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. You have to give locker to him. But the point is, if you're going to run business on that basis, don't compare the financial results. Allow people to run different. Don't have different prescriptions for different sets of things. So I believe going forward, what banks need in the public sector is firstly a recognition of their own strengths. Because if you don't build on your strength, recognize your strengths, build on those strengths, you won't be able to cope with your areas for improvement. The second is to persuade the government that so long as we exist, there is an obligation for you to fill up the board positions and to see that we have effective leadership at the top, at the level of the board. The third thing, which in fact only today I was responding to a questionnaire on that, tenures of chief executives. We've had, some of you might know, we've had a State Bank of India chairman for 1 month. We've had a State Bank of India chairman for 2 months. It's only in the recent last maybe 7, 8, 10 years that you've had State Bank chairman with reasonable spells of time. Now look at the size of this bank, and you're telling somebody that, okay, for 1 month he'll be the chairman, or maybe 6 months he'll be the chairman. There have been any number of cases like that. That is again a problem. It's been addressed a little bit. The third thing that you need to do is see that the rules and regulations that apply to the private sector and the public sector are not completely different. And the related point is you cannot get people who have no experience of public sector banking to prescribe for public sector banks. The PJ Nayak committee is a classic example. This was a person who came from a private sector bank. When you talk in terms of governance, his nomination committee recommended a candidate to succeed him. He didn't agree with that, therefore he stormed out of the board meeting without having a successor in place. But the RBI found only him fit to head the committee to improve governance in public sector banks. Or if you look at Ashok Ganguly in the Reserve Bank of India, writing the report on corporate governance. This was a man who was on the Infosys board and on the RBI board and on the board for financial supervision when the inspection report of ICICI Bank, when the inspection report went to the BFS and they ordered the second inspection to be done. I mean, huge conflict. I could keep you here till tomorrow telling you about the number of conflicts in the system. And I've seen all of them up close and personal. I can write 5 volumes of books if necessary on that. The point I'm making is you won't allow that to survive for a minute in the public sector. So you need to motivate people, you need to train people, you need to embolden them, encourage them to believe in public sector banking. I always say this, that pride, passion, and purpose, if a person has that wherever he's working and wears it on his sleeve, nothing can go wrong for that person. Thank you very much for the privilege. It's always a pleasure talking to people who, I always tell this to people, for many years I was the chief secretary of a leftist government. I worked with very senior comrades, Nipin Chakravarti and Damodaran. I was Damodaran's chief secretary for quite some time. So people sometimes ask me that, are you a subscriber to the leftist philosophy? I say what matters is if your heart is in the right place, it doesn't matter where your philosophy is. Your heart got to be in the right place. Thank you very much for having me share some thoughts. Thank you.